Today's movie kicks off with the story of a plane struggling through a terrifying storm. Our main character, whose name was Chuck, was sitting calmly in the restroom when suddenly the cabin pressure began to drop, causing the toilet door to burst open and a dangerous explosion to erupt in the cargo hold after a fire broke out. The pilot seated Chuck and informed him that they had to make an emergency landing in the ocean. The pilot handed him a life raft and told him to fasten his belt. The plane began descending rapidly. Now the aircraft was about 3,000 meters above the sea. At that moment, Chuck realized that the pocket watch his girlfriend had given him had fallen. The pilot told him to put on a life jacket, but it was on the other side. Because of the pocket watch, Chuck unfastened his seatbelt and staggered toward it to pick it up. However, as soon as he grabbed the watch and tried to reach for the jacket, he couldn't move due to the sudden change in the plane's angle. The pilot noticed he was no longer in his seat and unfastened his own safety belt. The violent jolts left the pilot badly injured. The pilot managed to touch the plane down gently on the ocean surface. But due to the rough landing, water began filling the cabin. Because Chuck was not wearing his seatbelt, his life was spared. Suddenly, the upper part of the plane burst open and seawater started flooding inside. Fortunately, Chuck had an inflatable raft in his hands, but as soon as he opened it, part of it got stuck in the plane. The sinking aircraft began dragging Chuck down with the raft. However, luck was on his side because the rope attached to the raft suddenly snapped and the life raft pulled him out of the jaws of death. Finally, Chuck safely reached the surface of the ocean. With all his strength, he tried to climb onto the raft and clung tightly to its edge with his last breath. But he slowly began drifting toward the engine, which was still running. Seeing the danger behind him, he immediately closed his eyes. Just then, the engine caught fire, and the shock wave from the explosion hurled him back into the sea. The entire plane sank slowly into the ocean with a massive blast. But the danger was far from over. Chuck not only had to face the violent ocean storm, but also the enormous waves rising one after another. He held tightly to the rope of the life raft. No one knows how much time passed like this, and suddenly the raft began losing air. Sharp rocks had torn it apart. That meant he had finally reached the shore. Gathering his last strength, he dragged the life raft onto land. The next morning, when sunlight fell on his face, he realized he was alive and had drifted onto a small island. But even after escaping the jaws of death, he found no relief because he did not know what kinds of dangers awaited him in this unknown place. As he walked, he collected scattered items from the plane and began searching the island for other survivors. But when he looked around, he was greeted only by endless silence. It was clear that he was stranded on an island that did not even exist on the world map. Is anyone here? To avoid dying on the island, he began thinking of various ways to survive. But at that moment, he had no effective method except writing a help sign on the beach. Soon night fell, and he still hoped that a passing boat might see him. But as the night grew darker, his hopes slowly turned into fear because of the surrounding silence. He kept trembling in fear after hearing the sounds of dangerous creatures in the jungle. The next day, he built a makeshift resting place from the items he had gathered and began inspecting the materials recovered from the plane. Now, apart from the pocket watch given by his girlfriend, nothing useful remained. Thinking about the moments he had spent with her, he regretted boarding the plane even more. In fact, before leaving for a business trip, Kelly had given Chuck the pocket watch so that when he returned at Christmas, they could get married. But a sudden plane crash had brought that wedding to a halt. Even when all his family members had accepted that Chuck had died in the accident, he stubbornly continued to live. But on this deserted island, finding food and water became a huge problem, and no one knew how long Chuck could survive. He gathered many parcels from his company, but he decided not to open them because it was a matter of professional integrity for him. Even though he was stranded on an unknown island, he did not want to betray his customers' trust. The help sign he had written on the beach the previous day had already been erased by the waves. He had to write it again using pieces of driftwood. Gradually, his desire to stay alive kept growing stronger. He knew that if he wanted to escape, he had to survive at all costs. But on this barren little island, apart from hard coconuts, he found nothing edible, and since he had no tool to crack them open, even opening a coconut became extremely difficult. Eventually, he managed to break one open with a sharp stone and began drinking its water, which tasted like nectar at that moment. Still, he was not satisfied with coconuts alone. Chuck decided to explore other parts of the island to fill his stomach. He wanted to climb to the highest peak and see everything, but the sharp mountain rocks made his path difficult. So he tore fabric from his pants with a stone, mixed in some leaves, and made himself a pair of makeshift shoes. When he reached the top, he realized it truly was a deserted island. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, and not a single human being was visible. As he stood there wondering how he could save his life, something strange in the distance caught his attention. Without thinking, he ran toward it. He thought it might be another pilot who had survived like him. But when he turned the body over, he realized the pilot had died long ago. Saddened, he dragged the body onto the island and gathered a few useful items from him: a wearable pair of shoes, a flashlight that still worked, and a useless wallet. He dug a grave for the pilot, buried him, and wrote his date of death on a rock. That evening, Chuck sat on the beach staring at his shoes. A strange sadness filled his heart. He felt that perhaps the next person lying in that grave would be himself. Because of this thought, he could not sleep that night. He realized that if he continued sitting idle, his death was certain. So the next day, he began learning survival skills in the jungle. He collected dew from leaves and stored it in coconut shells for drinking water. He sharpened a wooden stick to make a spear for catching fish. Even though it all seemed foolish, his constant efforts kept him from losing hope. That same night, while relieving himself, he saw a distant light. He shouted loudly to attract the boat's attention. He felt that he might not have to stay here any longer. He signaled with his flashlight so someone might see him. But because of the distance, the faint light was useless. As the light slowly disappeared from his sight, his heart filled with anger and helplessness. So the next morning, as soon as the sun rose, he impatiently took the torn raft and headed in the direction of the ship. It was the only hope of escape he had found after weeks of effort, and he was not ready to lose it. Although he desperately tried to cross the sea, he kept losing against the powerful waves. He showed courage countless times, but each time the sea pushed him back. Still, he refused to give up. He tried repeatedly, but eventually the waves swallowed him. Underwater, his thigh suddenly struck a sharp sea rock, and intense pain left his leg bleeding badly. He had no strength left to move forward. He dragged the broken raft back to shore in miserable condition. In the evening, a fierce storm and heavy rain began, worsening the already injured Chuck's trouble. With the raft, he could only cover the company parcel. Then, limping with his bleeding leg, he searched for shelter from the rain. He found a small cave and drank a few gulps of dirty rainwater to stay conscious. Completely exhausted, his injured body could endure no more, and he collapsed unconscious on the ground. As the flashlight battery died behind him, it too sank into darkness. The next day, Chuck woke up again with sharp pain. His leg wound showed signs of infection. In this deserted place, if it went untreated, he would face even greater danger. To gain even a slight hope of survival, he had to let go of his stubbornness and decided to open the parcels. Inside, he found a dozen videotapes, a gift-wrapped volleyball, a long dress belonging to a beautiful woman, and a stylish pair of skates. But he chose not to open the last parcel, perhaps because he did not want to feel disappointed, or perhaps because he wanted to preserve a final hope for himself. He used the foam from the packaging on his wound and tied a makeshift bandage with his shoelaces. The skate blades became his most useful tools, and from the black mesh of the long dress, he made a simple fishing net. With his fishing gear, he was finally able to eat a full meal after many days. To avoid swallowing raw food, Chuck decided to light a fire by rubbing wood together. Even though he kept trying from morning to evening, and then from evening to the next morning, the small spark in his heart did not turn into fire as he had hoped. When both his hands became raw from rubbing and fresh blood began to flow, Chuck's anger burst out. The harsh life on the island and his old injuries had completely broken him. Sitting by the shore, he washed his wounds in the water, and the sharp pain reminded him of his suffering. Now survival was a question he could no longer avoid. The volleyball he had thrown away in anger lay near his feet, bearing the bright red imprint of his fresh bloody palm. Suddenly, a strange thought came to his mind. With his saliva, he drew two eyes and a faint smile on the palm print. Now the volleyball looked like a human face. Perhaps because of extreme loneliness, he decided to make this face his friend. He named the volleyball Wilson and kept it with him so it could accompany him in his life. The scene was strange, but at least he no longer felt alone. Under Wilson's watchful presence, Chuck seemed to regain his strength. As he rubbed the wood faster and faster, real sparks flew between the pieces. Seeing the flames, Chuck was overjoyed, as if he had won a great battle. The fire was not only a way to cook food, but also a signal of his presence. At night, while eating, he talked to Wilson about his condition. According to his calculations, he had drifted more than 4,000 miles away. That meant if he hoped someone would find him, the chances were almost impossible. But now Chuck had no other option. He simply kept trying to stay strong and survive. Eating raw food and living in filth caused his damaged tooth to swell and become infected. Finally, unable to bear the pain, he decided to pull the tooth out himself. He held the skate blade against the tooth with one hand and picked up a stone with the other. He thought it was better to endure one sharp pain than prolonged suffering. Then he struck hard. Even after becoming an expert at surviving in the jungle, the spark in his eyes was gone. Within 4 years, Chuck had turned into a wild man. Although he had no shortage of meat because he had become skilled at catching fish, the hope for life had disappeared from his eyes. He no longer expected to escape, and each day of survival was just another day of loneliness. After some time, he found a sheet of tin near a cliff and brought it to the beach. When the sea breeze knocked the tin piece down, an idea suddenly struck him. If he could use it to cut through the ocean waves, maybe he truly had a chance to escape this place. The moment this idea came to him, he did not wait even a second. He wanted to leave this deserted island as soon as possible. Chuck sprang into action. First, he had to build a boat. He gathered many branches and placed them together. Then he used wild vines as ropes and tied everything tightly. He even turned the useless videotapes into makeshift ropes. Now Chuck's mental state began to deteriorate. He started feeling as if Wilson was watching him and did not want him to leave. That night, he argued with Wilson. "I can't spend my whole life talking to you. Did you hear me, you worthless volleyball?" In anger, he kicked away his 4-year-old friend. But after calming down, he felt deep regret for what he had done. So in the darkness of the night, he went searching for Wilson and lovingly repainted his face. Each day passed like this, and eventually Chuck's wooden boat was ready. He prepared everything for departure. Now he was just waiting for the wind to blow in the right direction so he could launch his boat into the sea. He also left behind a sign of his being stranded. He had set a world record of being stuck on this merciless island for more than 10,500 days. As he carved the last letter, suddenly the wind began blowing in the direction he wanted. Excitedly, he pushed the boat toward the sea and set out in search of life with his old friend Wilson. The ocean waves were still as fierce as ever, but they could not stop him from heading home. Like the waves of a lake, each wave nearly drowned him, but he kept cutting through them with determination. Every time he escaped the jaws of death, his joy of moving forward grew stronger. When Chuck looked back at the small island that had imprisoned him for 4 years, he felt something strange in his heart. If he had not stubbornly faced this hardship, perhaps he would still be living a life consumed by loneliness. However, his battle had only just begun. He had no idea that the dangers waiting ahead would be his deadliest challenge. Just when he thought he would drift along and eventually reach human civilization, another violent storm struck. That night, the heavy rain made it impossible to open his eyes. Helplessly, he clung to the boat between the raging waves and endured their attacks. It was the hardest night of his life. He was powerless and had left everything to God. Fortunately, Chuck was lucky. The terrible storm did not take him away, but it badly damaged his boat. Most importantly, his old friend had been separated from the boat because the rope had loosened. By the time he realized it, Wilson had already drifted far away with the waves. Wilson was his only companion, the one he spoke his heart to. Even though it was just a volleyball, it was his only support. Forgetting everything else, Chuck jumped into the sea and tried to save him. But the distance was too great, and the deep ocean frightened him again and again. On one side was the boat that was keeping him alive, and on the other was Wilson, his companion of 4 years. He had no choice. He could only watch as his old friend drifted farther away before his eyes. "Wilson, forgive me." In this way, he lost his only friend, and once again, loneliness and helplessness surrounded him completely. Looking at the almost completely broken wooden boat and the endless ocean around him, Chuck understood very clearly that he might never return home. The desire to live that had just been rekindled inside him shattered once again. Finally, he threw away the boat's oar and decided that he would quietly wait for the sea to swallow him as soon as possible. Just when Chuck prepared himself to face death, a whistle echoed, one he had only ever heard in his dreams. Gathering his last bit of strength, despite having lost all hope, he turned and saw a massive cargo ship floating before him. The people aboard the ship saw Chuck as well, and after years of hardship, he finally returned home, once again sitting in an airplane. The story of his safe return made him famous throughout the city, but none of that mattered to Chuck. He only wanted to meet his girlfriend, whom he had not seen in 4 years. However, when a man opened the door instead of her, he was stunned. The man said, "I am Kelly's husband." At that moment, Chuck realized that the woman he had kept remembering was now married and a mother of a child. Kelly's husband tried to calm Chuck and defend his wife. "Maybe you should give her a little more time," he said before leaving. Seeing Kelly in tears, Chuck understood her situation. He knew it was not her fault. Perhaps he would have done the same. That night, the company hosted a welcome feast featuring seafood. Seeing the delicious fish and large crabs on the table, Chuck felt something strange. Memories of the island flooded his mind because the crabs and fish that once seemed boring, there had now become delicacies here. The next day, Chuck delivered the parcel he had never opened on the island to its destination and included a thank you. He expressed his gratitude, saying that this very package had saved his life. He never opened that mysterious parcel to find out what was inside that had remained his companion for so long. And with that, this wonderful story came to an end. Now you tell me, how did you like this video? If you enjoyed it, be sure to check out more videos on my channel and let me know in the comments which movie explanation you would like to see next.